about Genesis. So he says very, very clearly that if logic tells you that the universe always had existed, then clearly our reading of Genesis, which seems to imply that the universe exists only a certain amount of time, must be incorrect. And we must understand that in an allegorical manner. In the same way that he pointed out many, many times in his works, that when it says, and God saw all that was good, or and God said, let there be light, do we really think that God had vocal cords? We know that in order to say something, there must be air molecules vibrating. And did God, before he created the universe, create air molecules and vibrations in these air molecules? And for what purpose? Who was listening? I mean, it's absurd. It's absurd. No one really reads the Genesis account and thinks that. In the same way, there are many aspects of the Genesis account that are clearly meant allegorically. There are some things about which it's not clear whether they're meant allegorically or not. As children, we maybe think, God, whatever, some kind of a human with a long white beard, right, and saying, let there be light. We get a little bit older, we get a little bit more sophisticated, and we then see that, no, this means something deeper, something more mystical. And the more sophisticated we get, the more we might see deeper meanings in these things and realize that we don't have to accept necessarily all the literal implications of the story. And Rambam said, although it's a very seemingly fundamental idea that the universe exists only a certain amount of time, it's not a fundamental of Judaism that we must accept under any circumstances. If philosophy, or what today would be considered science, proves that it's not the case, we're reasonable people, we'll accept it. But since Aristotle's theory was not totally convincing, and he laid out many arguments to show why, he said, no, in that case we have a choice. We have a choice to accept Aristotle or not accept Aristotle. And since Genesis tells us, seems to imply that the universe is not eternal, then we'll assume that that's in fact the correct reading. Now we come like full circle back to the beginning. So we have here a very, very beautiful theory that explains a tremendous amount of things, that makes incredible predictions that are verified. We certainly don't want to just like say, oh, well, it's not. Okay. Now, how does this tie in back where we started talking about breishis? Right? Now, what does this, in theory, what does this have to do with breishis? Breishis tells us that God created the universe. Right? Well, maybe God created the universe in this way.
One sentence. God said, let there be a Big Bang.
Right. Then, on top of this, you have the theory of evolution, that after X amount of billions of years, you have all kinds of chemical processes occurring, and you had molecules forming, and then you had self-replicating molecules, and then you had what we call life coming from these self-replicating molecules. Of course, life has no scientific definition. There's no difference between living and non-living, just in the name that they use, organic chemistry and so on, but there's not a scientific distinction. So you have this smooth emergence of more and more complicated molecules, eventually to form something that we would all agree is living. Now, where in that model is there something that contradicts, let's say, if you leave out just breishis, religion in general? Nothing, of course. I mean, religion certainly believe that there's a God who created the universe and designed it in such a way that it would expand and life would emerge from it. What in there contradicts in any way Judaism without breishis itself? Nothing. So, Baruch Hu, he designed the world, and then he gave mitzvahs, and he revealed the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu. There's nothing. There's no contradiction whatsoever. What in there contradicts anything other than in the whole Chumash, other than the first section about breishis? Absolutely nothing. Okay, we're told we keep Shabbos because God rested from creation. We have 6 days. Now we get to the specifics. So what does that mean? Somebody had a question.
First of all, in terms of the Vayomer Hashem, I don't know if we could use that to say that shows that this whole thing is not to be taken literally, because
I agree.
I mean, it sounds like the Vayomer Hashem is like the whole Torah.
No. I agree. Certainly, it doesn't imply that everything has to be taken literally. In fact, there was a famous philosopher by the name of Philo who got into a lot of trouble because of that, and he wrote, this is like 2,000 years ago, he wrote an allegorical interpretation of breishis, and then later on people started allegorizing the mitzvah also, and they said you don't really have to do it. These things, though, have traditional interpretation. As you can see, Rashi brings down interpretations, and Rambam talks about it. Clearly, they did not interpret these things literally. Rambam says very openly that the Shesh and breishis are not meant to be interpreted literally. That is a traditional point of view that we believe, and we believe that Rambam was who Rambam was, that this comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not that Rambam made it up. So there are things which are not meant to be literal, but clearly, as you say, it doesn't mean that everything in the breishis account is not literal, and certainly not everything after that is like allegorical. But to some people, it sounds radical to say, how can you say that something in the breishis account is not meant literally? And they confuse that with, it sounds like you're saying that this is not God-given, or it sounds like what you're saying, this is not true. God gave the whole Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, literal dictation, word by word. Everything in there is true. But what does it mean that something is true? We believe that Vayomer Hashem Yehior is true, and it's words that God gave to Moshe Rabbeinu literally, each word. Vayomer Hashem Yehior. But that doesn't mean that what we believe is true is that God had vocal cords and vibrated. That's not what we mean by saying that it's true. It's true, and it's from Moshe Rabbeinu. But the interpretation comes from all the traditional sources and tells us it's something much more profound and not to understood literally.
So you're saying how you can also say that the beginning of something is an idea, so you can explain the whole thing why it says that there were 6 days versus there one day. You're saying that like that first thing was the idea of it, and then that one day thing was when it all came to being with the system and the nature and the universe.
Okay, I wasn't exactly saying that. That's a way of interpreting, for example. I'm just saying that the very fact that God gave us this word for word and gave us these two things which seemingly contradict each other, right? I mean, you have something with 6 days and something with 1 day, something where man was created before, after. They seem to contradict each other. So obviously God wants to tell us something here, right? There's a reason that this is given to us in two seeming contradictory ways. I think that there's the possibility that just like in other ways, God is telling us, don't be careful when you read these. These are very deep things. Don't misunderstand it. Don't think that God has vocal cords. And don't think that you understand what 6 days mean. Because you're right, well, there was 1 day. Now, Chazal can interpret the 1 day really as the 6th day and so on. But there's a reason that it was written this way. Right? I'm not saying that it's not like Chazal and it really all happened on the 6th day. But if God wanted to say that, all he had to do is say, B'yom HaShishi, Adam, this and this and that. But he didn't write it that way. He wrote it this way. And I think that that's a flag to us. Don't think that you understand what this is just by reading it and translating it into your language. And all, I mean, the major Mefarshim and all of them, all talk about the breishis account as the deepest, along with the Maaseh Merkavah, the deepest mystical source in our tradition. So clearly, there's a lot of weight to these things. Again, that's not to negate the possibility of interpreting Torah literally. As I stressed, I'm not saying that you can't interpret everything totally literally, including the God as a vocal cord, unless some people will say that it's a person to say that. But however you want, whatever you want is literal, whatever you want is not literal. It's not a problem. It's very clear when you're reading Midrash and Kabbalah and so on and so forth that people did not understand these things in a literal sense. Again, that does not mean that it's false. It doesn't mean that one should ignore it. It's very, very, very deep things. To a child, you can say, God saw, God said, God stretched out his arm and took us out of Egypt. And a child has whatever imagery they have of that. We know we have a different vision of that. And if you think deeply into it, you can let go a childlike acceptance of some of the other things that we have, which maybe people haven't really thought deeply about. So we have to believe that the universe was created in 6 days. So first, I would throw back to you and say, you explain to me, let's say it says, Vayar Hashem Esahar V'Yikra, and Vayomer Hashem Yehior. What does that mean to you? Your science majors. Just tell me, what does it mean to you? Let's say somebody called here, Vayomer Hashem Yehior. What does that mean? What happened? What does it describe? Anybody? What do you imagine? But what is the process? Vayomer Hashem is talking about it. Vayomer Hashem. Hashem said Yehior. What is that describing? Some guy was talking and he said the words Yehior. Now, you all studied a little bit of science. What is words? I mean, vibration of vocal cords. And it has to be air. There's no air, like in space they can't hear the scream, right? There's no air, there's no sound. Right? But clearly, God did not yet create the air. So if sound is vibrations in the air, then God did not say Vayor, and probably he didn't create vocal cords for himself. So there was God vibrated his vocal cords and caused the air to vibrate, and the sound carried to whom? Who was he speaking to? Clearly that's not what we believe, right? I mean, it's not likely that we ever believe that that's what breishis meant. Correct? Did Moshe Rabbeinu or Yeshua think that's what it meant? Probably not, right? So what does it mean? Vayomer Hashem Iyar. What does it mean? I mean, so it doesn't mean Vayomer Hashem Iyar, right? So what does it mean? Well, it means something very, very deep. And you have to learn Gemara, you have to learn Medrash, you have to learn Kabbalah, you have to learn a lot of things to know what it means. But it doesn't mean God said, "Let there be light." Does anybody, you can disagree with me on that, right? Rambam talks about anthropomorphisms in the Torah. He talks about people who believe that God is body, and he considered that to be apikarsus, to be avodah zarah. The famous Raidva who says better people than you have thought that. Doesn't say that it's right, because some people actually think that God is a body. So. Without the Big Bang theory, clearly Vayomer Hashem Yor does not mean Vayomer Hashem Yor. And so on throughout the whole breishis story. Okay, I'd like to answer questions afterwards. We certainly don't mean it in the physical, literal, surface meaning of the English translation. It's talking about very profound things that are true, that happen, but not at the level you get to an absurdity if you interpret it purely physically like that. There are other indications. For example, everybody knows the breishis story, and everybody knows the Garden of Eden story. Okay, now they're very separate. First you have one, then you have the other. The very beginning of the Garden of Eden story, how does it start? Does anybody know? Anybody know what is the very, very beginning? What is the last word? After it says, by foolish mind, Mars, also on and all, etc., etc. What is the next pasuk after Shabbos? Ela told Shemayim ba'aretz. What's the next word? The Yom Asot Hashem Shemayim Ba'aretz. In the day that God made them. And then you have Adam and Rishon. Okay, what is the obvious contradiction, so to speak? It took one day. All right? You have two stories placed one after the other, where the second story tells you something totally different. Man was created separately from the woman. Animals were created after the man. That's what it seems, that God brought the animals to man, and so on and so forth. A very different kind of story, and it happens in one day. Now, whoever, even if a skeptic says that this is not a divine document, I mean, the person's not an idiot. Nobody thinks that the person who put it together is an idiot. Why do they put two stories that contradict each other? All right? So clearly the people who put this together didn't think it contradicted each other. And Chazal tell us, in fact, all this occurred, for example, on the sixth day. Right? It's an expanded version, like you have a map and then you have a blow-up map in the middle. But what actually happened on that day when God created heaven? But if you read it in a totally literal fashion, without any chazal, you'll get to strange ideas. So clearly the Jewish conception of breishis is not the literal English translation meaning. And there's a much more even radical Jewish conception of breishis. What is the translation of the first two words? Breishis, bara, Elohim. What is the translation of those words in every English Chumash you open up? What does it say? In the beginning, God created heaven. That is not the true Jewish interpretation of those words. If you look at the first Rashi, you'll see he brings Mepharshim, will clearly state that grammatically that is not possible. Bereshit is a construct. It's Bereshit bri'at shemayim ba'aretz. So Bereshit bro Elohim shemayim ba'aretz. You cannot say in Hebrew, and he proves it from the Chumash. You cannot say Bereshit bara. It doesn't make sense. It's in the beginning of created God. It doesn't work. Grammatically, it just doesn't work. So you have to read it differently. And he brings two possibilities. One, Bereshit bro Elohim shemayim ba'aretz. Ba'aretz etat tov v'vo v'choshev al pnei tahom v'yom Elohim iyar. In the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, when everything was darkness and void and this and that, that's when God said, let there be light. In other words, it's not talking about that initial beginning instant. It's talking about in the beginnings of that, when things were like this, not in the beginning God created heaven. A totally radically different interpretation of breishis. That is not some strange interpretation, but according to Rashi, and Rashi is not making things up, he's bringing things from before, and those are presumably what Moshe Rabbeinu taught, that Bereshit shouldn't be read the way we're taught in these English translations. It's something else. It's not talking about necessarily that initial beginning point. Maybe it is at a deep level. Another interpretation that's brought there is Bereshit, avur Reshit, for those things called Reshit, bara Elokim b'shamayim v'aretz. What are those things called? Reshit, Torah, Israel, and so on. In other words, what's the point here? Bereshit bara Elokim means for those things called Reshit did God create heavens and earth. In other words, it's telling us why the universe was created, not how or when and how long. Again, the fact that here it says one day and there's like 6 days, it's obvious to us that God doesn't talk, and clearly God doesn't work for 6 days and the rest. These things are very deep, and we have to keep Shabbos on the 7th day for very deep reasons, but it doesn't mean the exact literal translation, or we don't have to believe that that's the only way to interpret it. There are many, many, many other ways to interpret it. And what it's trying to tell us, again, are the deep things, why God created, for what purpose God created. And those are exactly the things that science does not touch. Science does not deal with the meaning of life, does not deal with the purpose of life, does not deal with our emotions and all the great things that make life meaningful. It's two separate things. They both touch on very, very deep things. Science is trying to find out things about the universe from its perspective, those things that everybody can agree on, and it's a beautiful thing. The Chinese communists and that proverbial Satmar Chassid, they're both coming up with these same equations and making the same predictions. It has nothing to do with your philosophy. All you have to do is make certain assumptions about the physical universe, and you come up with these equations. Then you have implications of these equations, and then you can deal with implications. Now, there are many ways, there are many attempts to read breishis literally. Nevertheless, those are also consistent. You could do that. And in fact, those started 150 years ago when geologists first found the Earth is several millions of years old. Immediately, the Christian geologists came with various theories to explain how it could be that the breishis story is like this and it's millions of years. And what they came up with, among other things, were that the 6 days of creation were 6 epochs. The thing which we hear nowadays from Jewish writers was already written about 150 years ago by Christians who were trying to reconcile geological findings with the long pre-Big Bang and evolution ideas of geology. Then when evolution came about, you had, again, Christian writings about the same thing. If you believe in the breishis story, and you accept that there's a God who's all-powerful, then also God could have created exactly like it says in breishis. He could have said, Vayihi or, God could create vocal cords, create airwaves. He could do everything as it says, literally, 100% literally, in the breishis story, if that's what you want. If God is all-powerful, God could do that. God could then, after the 6 days of creation, put everything into a logical, physical state. And that's how you can interpret Shabbos. Shabbos is the creation of the laws of nature, putting everything into the way that a scientist would have said it would be, and then letting it go according to those laws of nature. That's what it means God rested. God rested means he now did not have to control directly every little event and every blade of grass moving, but he created laws of nature to do that. It's the same thing. You can say that God every minute causes the blade of grass to move, or it's God's law of nature that causes it to move. It's the same thing, just using different words. So it's not that we cannot interpret literally the words of breishis. You can interpret 100% literally. God, I'll give you another literal interpretation. When is the first point of the creation of the when is the first point of the existence of the universe, if you believe, like breishis, that there's a God who created the universe? If you create something, what is the first instant of the existence of that creation? Tell me, whenever you made something. What is it? Okay, when it's finished. And in reverse, when is the first instant that you can say that that thing exists in some level? You have the idea. You have the concept in your head. Now, clearly, we believe that God, although it says, about Yarki Tov, he did this, he wasn't like tinkering. We don't think that he was tinkering. He said, oh, well, this is good, okay, I'll do it, right? We believe that basically there was a plan. And it was in order to give rise to a certain kind of universe in which there will be beings who will be able to choose between good and evil. They'll have intelligence to be able to learn the consequences of their actions and to foresee what it's going to be and to make a choice. It's a very complex kind of universe. Not every
Big Bang that you would create will give rise to that kind of universe. All right? You have to fine-tune a lot of the constants of nature to produce matter, certainly to produce complex entities. So in order to produce the Big Bang, certainly God would have had to think very carefully, so to speak, about, well, what kind of laws of nature should I create? What kind of universe? How many dimensions of space and time? And how should they be wired together? What should I create as the Big Bang and the laws of nature? In order that they should, a human being should emerge. Or if I want to create things in an ad hoc way, and then I want to create laws of nature, which we know exist now, what kind of laws of nature should I create on the seventh day so that they can take over and run things the way we know that they kind of run things now? So there's a lot of thought. So first you would probably have to start with, you said, the end. You have the end result. Right? So that's Shabbat. You start with the human being. You start with the idea that you want to create an entity that can make a free choice between good and evil. From that follows a whole universe in which there will be now moral challenges. From that follows the specifications, what kind of space and time, and how you're going to wire space and time, and how many dimensions, and what kind of laws of nature there will have to be in order for all this to exist. That's what you have to have before you even start and say, Yehi Or. Right? So maybe the breishis story is a literal description, so to speak, in human terms, of the creation of that kingdom. Right? Because that's when creation really starts. When God is thinking, okay, I'll have this, okay, there'll be light, right? And I'll have this, okay, and I'll make waters, and I'll split that into, and of course these things have much more deeper meaning than just waters, but if you want to read it purely literally, and okay, now what I'll do is, yes, okay, I'll do that, I'll do this, and then God says, okay, now I'm going to create laws of nature which will all do that. I say, aha, that's the Big Bang that I have to create. If I create, that's what I'll need in order to produce everything that I want. I say, let there be a Big Bang. Or, God creates it in actuality, right? With the light, spreading, splitting, exactly as it says in breishis. Literally, he says with vocal cords, with air, however fundamentalist and literally you want to be, it's okay. And then at the end of the seventh day, or on the seventh day, and the sixth day, whatever, on Shabbos, he says, okay, let me take this creation that I've made with all these pieces, and let me create everything in a system that works by itself. Okay, so again, you can read breishis totally literally. Nothing contradicts science whatsoever, because the end result will be a universe exactly as we know it now, which predicts this equation, which if you would take it all the way back, would predict the existence of the Big Bang. Did that Big Bang really exist or not? Did time really start only in a middle point where God kind of then created laws of nature? That's not something that even interests science, because you can't make a prediction about it. The universe is now in such a way that when you look at the universe, you make the measurements, you make predictions, this is what you get. Which, if you predict backwards, gives you a Big Bang. Based on that, you can make assumptions, you can make predictions, which you can measure the microwave background radiation. Whether it really happened that way, or God fiddled with it along the way and made it to be that way, is not of interest to science. And if you say it that way, you can say it that way if you want. It has nothing. Even a person who believes that God made it in the literal way and then fiddled with it to make it into the universe that we know now, still will find this very interesting, because God created this equation. God made the universe so that it fits this equation, and presumably we can learn a lot of interesting things if we do that. Or you can say breishis clearly is not meant at the literal level. Not that God couldn't do it that way, but that's not what it means, and that's not what we're intended to think that it means. And nobody ever thought that that's what it means, because nobody ever thought that God did this, and the two stories clearly are meant to show us that they're contradictory if you read them so overly literally. So it means something differently, and in fact, yes, God created the Big Bang, just like this equation says. And everything in between. Okay? Now there's this little poem, so to speak, on the reverse side of this page. Okay, I wrote the following, which on the face of it bears virtually no resemblance to Genesis, is a composite of traditional understandings of the creation referred to Genesis. Okay, I just took out little pieces from different midrashim and from Zohar and from whatever, and put it together totally out of context deliberately to make this, every statement of which basically can be found somewhere in some source. Before all was created, God reigned, and after all ended, God reigned. Time emerged from no time, and there passed 17.5 billion years. And at the beginning, 974 generations prior to that of Adam, God was to have created the universe, but didn't. God contracted himself and emanated a number of emanations from himself in descending water of contact with the divine. God looked then into that part of himself, which is the Torah, and created the universe from a black fire. God then created and destroyed several universes. Then God created a universe in one day, containing, among other things, a two-headed male-female creature with scales, webbed fingers, and a tail, whose height was such that it could see from one end of the world to the next. At first, God wanted to create a female and a male separately, but then God decided not to. In the heavens, God created two suns, but changed one into a moon later on, etc., etc. Every statement here comes, and many people recognize, some Medrash, some Zohar, something somewhere, right? Nobody ever intended to collapse this, deliberately doing it, right? But, I mean, this is more different from breishis, I think, than the Big Bang Theory is different than breishis. All right? This contradicts breishis. But this is what we believe. Okay, so something that seems on the face of it to contradict breishis doesn't contradict breishis. It's just a different way. You have to understand what this is, a different way of seeing it. And I just summarize here. There's virtually no similarity in the above creation account, and I give by the Bible. They contradict each other no less. Every idea derives from traditional sources. Science, the Kabbalah, and the Midrash are all systems which provide explanations regarding certain aspects of reality, and do so from different perspectives. They see things differently and are interested in answering different types of questions. Thus, each system describes the origin of the universe from the point of view of its concerns, leading the unwary to the impression that this difference implies a contradiction and conflict. Okay? So, whenever you have many different ways of answering the question, you can be led to two conclusions. If all the answers contradict each other, you say, well, it happened like this, it did like this, it did like that. So you say, well, they can't clearly all be true, so therefore none of them are true. That's one possibility. Or you can say, you know what, there's so many different ways to answer this that, you know what, there's no question. Now I realize that what seemed like a disturbing question is not really a question, because if I think of it like this, the question following, like this, the question following. So in the end, you get to a point, and that's kind of the point where I got to after thinking about this for many years, that there really is no question. It's only when you look at things the wrong way, it's like these two models. If you look at it like this, you have space-time, and it's flat, and this, and then you have an acceleration. Suddenly you realize you can look at it in a totally different way, and it's the space-time that's curved, and the world line that's geodesic and straight. And then everything gets answered. Right? It kind of depends on how you look at it. You can look at it, if you want to, look at it as a flat space-time, that's fine, there's an acceleration, that's okay. But you have a more, in a way, sophisticated model that allows you to make different predictions that are verified if you look at it in a different way. And I think that a lot of the questions that people have about supposed conflicts between religion and science is just a matter of how you're looking at things. And then when you realize that there are all these other perspectives, hopefully what happens is that you begin to realize that it's not just, well, there are many good answers, but that the question itself only arises when you're looking at it somehow from the wrong perspective. That's it, though. You've got to take questions. My conception of the written Torah, the way I understand it and explain it to people, is that the written Torah is a subset of the oral Torah, and not the reverse. The Jewish people had a tradition before they received the written Torah. They had tradition from Abraham, they had traditions all along, until the time that they received the Torah. Along with the Torah came interpretations of what the Torah is all about. And there are secret teachings which form the Kabbalah, which were never written down. All this is the oral Torah. The written Torah is a subset of that. And to understand the written Torah, you have to look at the oral Torah. I mean, after all, does anybody believe that when it says, and God said, let there be light, did God say it? Does God have vocal cords? Was there air? We all know sound is motion of air molecules. Did God create vocal cords for himself and then create air before he created the universe so that he could say something? And who was he saying it to? And what? It's clear that that does not mean saying, as we know. When it says God saw, does God have eyes? Is there photons of light coming into his brain, into his eye, and being transferred to his retina? It's absurd. So clearly those things don't mean the literal sense of things. They're very, very deep things, and they have very, very deep meanings. Why should we interpret literally the other things about the days and about... It's not necessary to interpret literally. Rambam speaks very clearly about not interpreting them literally. One can, if one wants to. But I don't think it's fair to say
that Judaism believes this in the same way that maybe people at the time of Copernicus said, the Bible believes that the earth is the center of the universe, and anyone who says different is heresy. And then when that theory is overthrown, suddenly people say, well, the Bible has been disproved. It's just not true. If a person feels that they want to understand it this way, that's fine. But it is certainly not the Jewish understanding of Genesis is that the universe is 6,000 years old according to our conception of time, and was created in 6 days, which are days. That's a legitimate interpretation. It's not necessarily the interpretation. And it would be misrepresenting Judaism to present it as the interpretation. The religious conception of the universe is that the universe was created as an act of will by a conscious entity for a purpose. Humans are created in the image of this divine entity, whatever that means. And the purpose of the creation of the universe is intimately tied to human activity, maybe the activity of other races elsewhere, we don't know.
Everything started with some points or something like that, right? So would that mean that all matter, energy, everything is all in one point? Shouldn't that also mean that it first takes them around it? Like, shouldn't it?
Okay. And again, the idea is it's a little bit counter. Somebody did this sefer. Somebody computed it, trying to know the generations of Noah and this and that, and came up with this number, and then it became like